And you can start, Janet.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. So today we're going to do a quick tour through all about lavender. I am, just to introduce myself, I am Janet Okudasano. I'm the Cornell Cooperative Extension of Onondaga County Agriculture and Food Systems Leader, and I am also a lavender farmer. So let's jump right into it. Oh, that's a little further than I wanted. Um, I wanted to first talk a little bit about the benefits of lavender. There have been many, many studies on lavender. Lavender has been being used medicinally for well over 2 centuries. So it is one of those plants that has had a long line of folklore associated with it, as well as a lot of actual evidence-based research. So I wanted to just go over a few of the evidence-based things. One of the one that sticks out most directly to me is that lavender has been used to treat anxiety and depression in many, many different studies. And the lavender use here is aromatic. So, a particular study, they had folks who were about to go into a surgery smell, just have lavender, fresh English lavender near them on their body for 15 to 30 minutes before their surgeries. And the actual evidence was a reduction in blood pressure, reduction in respiratory rate, and calmness as a result. So that's one of the biggies I think we can talk about with lavender. It's also been known to help with headache, smelling the lavender, and hot cold compresses that include lavender. So I think I just wanted to give everyone a little overview. If you go to the Cleveland Clinic, this link, you'll be able to access probably 30 some odd uses of lavender in evidence-based research that promotes health. And then I have three specific ones on this slide, and you'll be able to, I believe, get these slides later that describe exact research projects and give you all of the results. So thinking a little bit about lavender and its morphology, I wanted to go over this a little bit because we'll be talking about lavender as a plant as well as lavender production. So lavender is one of those plants that's considered a flowering sub-shrub. So it's not exactly a shrub and it's not exactly a bush, but it's somewhere in between. And most of the lavender that we'll be talking about today is going to have this morphology where there's a stem with leaves coming up in lateral directions and then a spike. The spike is the actual inflorescence, and you'll see that the spike is composed of whorls where there's a congregation of flowering structures, the buds and the petals, and then there are gaps between the whorls. These are some of the ways in which different types of lavender are identified, looking at the inflorescence and the inflorescence shape. And then when you look at an individual bud, you'll notice that there's a flowering structure, the petals, and then the calyx, bract, and bracteole. These are actually the buds. When you get lavender buds, like in a sachet, you're actually not getting the petals, you're getting this structure. So I wanted to make sure everyone had a sense of that. And here is a photo of a typical lavandula. This is an English lavender, what it might look like. And then to the right of that, you'll see a different type of lavender. This lavender is a stoichus, and you can see that it has flower petals on top of a bud bract, but there's a very different sort of morphology to that. Just to be clear, I'm going to be talking mostly about lavender that grows well in the Northeast. So I'll be talking more about the lavender that you see in this left image, not Stotius. Stotius is more of a warmer climate Mediterranean lavender. Oops, and I'm going the wrong way. So let's talk a little bit about lavender phylogeny. Um, It belongs to the genus Lamiaceae, and it is in the same botanical family as the mints. So it has typically square stems and volatile oils. Those volatile oils are why human beings have been using lavender for centuries. At this point in time, there has been a great deal of genetic mapping of the biochemical properties of those oils and fragrances, the underlying biochemicals that produce them. And that has led to 39 species being clearly identified, and then also somewhere around 400 different varieties. So this is a really, really large group of plants. There are 8 actual genera, so a genus of lavender that have been described. But in the horticulture trade, there are really only about 3, and they're on the right side of this slide. The ones we're going to focus on today are the species that are Lavandula angustifolia. And some of the common categories are, it's called true lavender, or more commonly English lavender. Be very careful when you're talking about lavender that you try to refer to the genus, the species, which would be angustifolia, and then whatever the cultivar or variety is, because these terms are sort of loosely interchanged and it's easy to get confused about what you would actually be producing if you're not careful in how you describe the nomenclature. Hybrids from Lavandula include the intermedias, so angustifolia with another type of lavender plant, another cultivar, and those are referred to sort of generically as lavandins. And we'll be talking a lot about these and a lot about angustifolia. For our purposes today, these other 2 genera are not terribly important, but I wanted you to know that they exist. And if you're interested, I've included a link to a nursery that gives a lot of great descriptions of them. So, what varieties might you want to grow in the Northeast or northern parts of the country? And looking at the research that was out there, the best study I found is a little old. It actually started in 2010, but the reason I like this study by the Chicago Botanic Garden is that it took place over a 7-year period, and it explored over 40 different lavender varieties, but it's not all at the same time. So you have a link to it here in the slides. And the thing that I want to point out is they rated a bunch of characteristics of lavender. Not only, so they got down to the species and variety level, they also gave you information about the flowering structure, the bloom period, the flower size, what type of flower production you might expect from that variety, leaf color, which can be important in landscaping, and, of course, height, width, and then the amount of time they trialed that particular variety. So, for instance, if you look down here, and I know this is hard to read, but there's an angustifolia, so an English lavender called Silver Mist, that had a great flower production, beautiful foliage. They trialed it for 1 year. They didn't get enough information, so it only got 2 stars, as compared to something like Lavandula angustifolia Super Blue, which they trialed for between 4 and 5 years, and they got so much more information on it. So when you look at their top rated lavenders, please, refer back to this sheet so you know exactly how long they trialed them. But this reads pretty true to me in my experience with the varieties I have tried here in the Northeast. In that Royal Velvet does very good where I'm at. Munstead is an old standby that grows really well almost everywhere in the Northeast and northern part of the country. Super Blue is a good one. I have not tried Gene Davis, but Phenomenal is also quite phenomenal. And it is a non-angustifolia, so it is one of the lavandin varieties, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in a few minutes. So, looking at the specific varieties that are most frequently grown here in northern climates, we tend toward the angustifolias for a variety of reasons. One, the English lavender is actually all of the English lavenders are far better suited to cold climates. They can handle the temperature fluctuation. They're hardy to below 0 degrees if they are able to sort of gradually slide into dormancy. And there are multiple cultivars that are longtime favorites. So we talked about Munstead, and another one that is one of my favorites is Hidcote, and then another is Royal Velvet. I will also point out that these Lavandula angustifolia plants are also referred to as culinary lavenders. They do not contain as much camphor, which is the chemical that actually contains the oil, holds the oil in the plant. So they're better suited for cooking. And then some of the intermediates, so lavandin, that we have in the north that grow well and that I know are growing in multiple lavender farms across the Northeast. Provence. Provence is also one that's highly prized in drying bouquets, drying for sachets. Grosso, again, another very fragrant and frequently grown for bouquets and um, dried lavender buds. And then Phenomenal is newer on the scene. It's a newer variety. It was developed by Peachtree Farm in Pennsylvania. It is still copyrighted or patented by Peachtree Farm in Pennsylvania. So you cannot propagate it yourself. That's an important point to remember. And it was bred for disease resistant scent and form. And one of the things that I can say about Phenomenal is for the first 5 years, it is definitely phenomenal. And the harvests from this plant continue being extremely highly aromatic for over 3 years as a dried plant, as a dried flower, as long as they're not in direct sunlight. And then the Stotius, beautiful Mediterranean variety. We cannot grow it here, but you will see it. I saw it yesterday at Trader Joe's as a Stotius topiary. You will see it in garden centers, and it's beautiful while it will grow, but it won't last here longer than the summer. So this is phenomenal. I wanted to show you a larger image of it. It has a spherical and compact form, but it has very long stems, which are very highly prized in the cut flower industry. It claims to be perfect for fresh and dried flower arrangements. I have to tell you that fresh lavender, if you get 3 days out of fresh cut lavender in a vase before it starts wilting or getting a mold or fungus, you have done a great job. Most lavender is going to do best as a dried stem. Here's a closer image of Hidcote. Hidcote's in my opinion, one of the prettiest little lavenders. It is absolutely nice, dark purplish blue, and it's a repeat harvest for me every year here in the north, and it's a great culinary lavender. So let's talk a little bit about growing lavender. Obviously, I spent this time on the varieties because I really want you to think about picking varieties that are going to grow well in your area. It's important if you're going to be actually, growing lavender at any scale. It's important that you test a small number of plants before spending the time and expense in committing to a variety. I know when I first started in 2021, I had read an article from Cornell that was working doing trials with lavender between New York and northern Pennsylvania farms. And I ended up picking Grosso and Hidcoat right off the bat just because of their performance in those trials. So I strongly encourage you to pick varieties you know are going to grow well in your area, but then also test a small number of plants because the first couple of years with Grosso on my farm, it did not perform very well. I have colleagues that also grow lavender just south of me, like not very far south, maybe 30, 40 minutes. And Grosso is their best growing plant. So the microclimate where you are at will significantly affect how well your farm is going to do. Regardless of where you are throughout the world with lavender, you want a location with well draining soil. Lavender cannot stand to have wet feet, and it will quickly get disease, some sort of fungal disease, if it is not in well draining soil. So they recommend that you plant lavender in sandy, loamy soils. And the pH of lavender, I've heard a lot of differences here, anywhere from 6.5 to 8.5, but usually the standard recommendation is that the pH of the soil be 6.5 to 7.5, somewhere in that range. It has to have full sun. And although sometimes we talk about full sun, or we try to get full sun at 6 hours a day, lavender really needs between 8 and 12 hours a day of full sun to grow as healthy as it possibly can. The other component of preventing lots of diseases in lavender is to not bunch them up against themselves or any other plants or even structures. Don't plant any other plants within 3 to 4 feet of a lavender plant. So if you're planting a row, that means that there will be, at least on my property, I planted a lavender plant, I went 4 feet, and then I planted another lavender in that lane. And then the space between the rows on my farm is between 6 and 8 feet, depending on when I actually planted. So that distance between plants and between rows is really important over time. Lavender starts, usually you're going to buy a plug. That's the least expensive and actually most often the hardiest way to grow lavender. It does not grow well from seed. And even if you do grow it from seed, many of the seeds have so many hybridized components that you're not going to know if it'll grow true year after year, or if the seed will go true to what it's labeled. So it's really better to get a plug of lavender, and if you're going to propagate it, to do so vegetatively. The phenomenal and grosso lavenders I mentioned a few minutes ago, they're going to grow from a plug to a plant that's about 3 cubic feet in size when it's mature. It'll take the lavender 3 to 5 years to get to that mature stage, but it's extremely important that you give it space to grow. Even though the first year or two, it might look like a little tiny plant in the middle of all this space, believe me, it'll catch up fast. Some of the data that's out there indicates that you can get between 1,000 and 2,400 plants per acre following the planting guidelines of 3 to 4 feet and 6 to 10 feet between rows. So that'll give you a little bit of a starting point, and I have more information for you a little later on about growing lavender for production. I strongly encourage you not to mulch with wood mulch. Wood mulch, any kind of straw, any sort of mulch that's going to retain moisture, especially if it's up near the crown of the plant. So the crown is right where the stem enters the ground and the space between the stem and the roots. Anything up near that crown that's going to hold moisture is also going to encourage fungal growth, and fungal growth is the biggest issue in having healthy lavender. So landscape cloth, most lavender farms use landscape cloth either in the lanes only, so in the lane that the lavender is planted, or they put landscape cloth down everywhere, between in the lanes and in the rows. So I think it's important to think about how you want to operate. On our farm, I have lanes of lavender with landscape cloth, and then I have grass between those lanes. And I I actually make little piles of stone around the crown of each plant to make sure that light is reflected and heat is reflected back up onto the plant, and moisture isn't sitting there next to the crown. One of the really great things about lavender is it is not a terribly needy crop. You don't need to fertilize it that often, and most of us can get away with a little bit of bone meal a couple of times a year. You also, in the Northeast, do not need to water it that frequently unless we're experiencing a drought. Um, on my farm, I water lavender that I have just planted. I water it every 2 or 3 days for the first 2 or 3 weeks after planting, and then I let it go. There was only one summer that I actually had to water lavender on my farm, and that was because we had about a 4 week drought period. Um, the other care component for lavender is you're going to want to trim it twice a year. In late August or September, well, you're going to be harvesting it in the summer, but then in late August or September after harvest, you're going to want to give it a nice pruning to shape it and to sort of remove some of the vegetation before the lavender is going to go into dormancy. And then at the beginning of the spring, when you start to see it just begin to green up, you're going to want to give it a really small prune just across the tops to stimulate further growth. So let's talk about pests and diseases for a minute. I mentioned fungal issues. So root rot in the form of Phytophthora, Pythium, I can't pronounce that third one. Fungal diseases like botrytis, alfalfa mosaic virus. These are all issues that lavender can get, diseases that can kill you, the lavender. And there's once it gets one of these fungal infections, it's nearly impossible to do anything about it. And if the fungus gets in your soil, you're really not supposed to plant lavender there again, I think, for like a 5 year time period. You'll also see lesser sorts of issues. Spider mites, they don't really cause a lot of damage on the lavender, but you will see, yellowing foliage, and if the lavender is not healthy to begin with, it can take it right on out. White flies, again, they can be a problem. They're not as big of an issue outside in the fields, but they can, once you get white fly infections, then that's an issue you have to deal with, of course. Spittlebug always hangs out on my lavender. People always ask, what's that frothy stuff? It doesn't really damage the lavender, but it is a point of conversation. When you are planting in the field, which is pretty much all lavender, the lavender doesn't grow well in a greenhouse after it's vegetated. I'm sorry, propagated, and it doesn't grow well indoors either. It just needs too much environmental interaction. It will grow well in pots outside, but when you're planting in fields, which is what your lavender farm is going to look like, moles and voles can be an issue if you have them on your property, and they can become an even greater issue if you're covering your lavender to protect it over the winter. So I know I have moles. You can see them on my property everywhere. But I don't cover the lavender over the winter where I'm at. And I haven't had the sort of issues that I've heard from lavender farmers, say out in the West Coast, where in Montana, for instance, they're covering acres and acres and acres of lavender with winter protective cloth. and moles and voles actually get down in the roots and make their homes and damage the plant roots, and then the lavender doesn't come back. So moles and voles can be an issue, but by far the biggest issue all lavender farmers have is if they have wet soil that's not draining very well, and or they have weeds up tight against the lavender plants that are holding moisture and creating issues for the plant to get enough airflow. So if you're thinking about producing lavender as a cut flower or any of the other things that you can produce and add value to with lavender, you're going to have to think a little bit about the harvesting methods and when you would want to harvest lavender for a specific purpose. So looking at culinary lavender, Kidcoat, Munstead, Royal Velvet, for instance, these varieties, you really want to harvest them by hand, as you can see in the lower right. We use sort of a scythe. It's just a knife that you go through, gather a bunch in your hand, and then cut it. And cutting by hand, if you're going to use it for culinary purposes, is mostly feasible for smaller size farms, and it's pretty easy to do. You then dry the lavender. If you're using it for culinary purposes, you're going to have to dry it. You're going to have to follow sort of food safety standards by drying it in a space that is humidity controlled, dust controlled. You don't want direct sunlight on it, and you want to be sure that you're following food safety precautions with your culinary lavender. If you have questions about how to grow culinary lavender for human consumption, your particular state and health department will have rules and guidelines that you need to follow. So I would strongly encourage you to reach out to them to find out what their food safety protocols are and how you can grow your culinary lavender. Essential oil lavender. Now I'm referring to essential oil lavender for both bouquets and well, for three things: for bouquets, for sachets, and for oil distillation. It's important to understand that lavender that you're using for aromatic purposes is, how do I describe this? If you want to make oil, essential oil from the lavender you're growing, you have to have a lot of lavender. And so that's why I put in as an example down here the flower yields for gross zone. So if you grab a bundle of lavender and you were to cut it with the knife I was describing earlier, you're looking for about 150 stems per bundle of lavender. And you'll get somewhere between 4 to 7 bundles per plant. And then it takes 12 to 15 bundles to give you a pound of dried buds. So if you're going to then distill from that, you're going to get a very, very small amount of essential oil from a single plant. Most essential oil production with lavender is happening in extremely large lavender farms where they harvest the entire plant mechanically instead of harvesting by hand. And they're using the plant, the leaves, as well as the buds, and getting essential oil from thousands of plants to get enough essential oil to make it feasible to sell it in the quantities that will make you a profit. That's not to say you can't distill with what you have in your property. It just means you're going to get a very, very small amount of essential oil if you don't have thousands of plants to work with. When you are harvesting lavender for dry bouquets or for sachets, you want to be sure that you're getting it before the inflorescence has actually opened up. So buds start blooming. Ideally, you're going to want less than a third of those buds open before or when you harvest. Um, if it's harvested for essential oil distillation, you wait a little bit longer. Drying lavender, again, just like the fresh plants, lavender is extremely susceptible to fungus. Cool, well-ventilated locations out of direct sunlight. Hanging the lavender upside down to dry is actually perfect because it puts all the oils right back in the top of the plant. So more information about lavender production. If you are serious about lavender as a cut flower or lavender as a product that you're going to sell, looking at some of these production estimates will give you a pretty good idea of what you're able to produce from an acre of lavender. I also have some information for you in the links at the bottom. You can go to very specific budgeting tools that will allow you to get an estimate of per stem or per plant per acre how much you are able to produce from a specific cultivar. So just looking at some of these on this slide, an acre of Lavandula angustifolia, so this is the English lavender. Notice the range there, 300 to 1,800 pounds of dried flowers, all right? That will give you about 2 gallons of essential oil if you're on the high end of what you're able to harvest. Cultivars with the intermedia lavenders, you can get more essential oil sometimes from the cultivars, but again, you have to have so much lavender to do that essential oil distillation. And then looking at Massachusetts, for instance, these flowers over here that they're talking about 12 to 15 bundles, pounded dried buds. Most of this, they're bundles per acre. They're going to be selling bouquets or dried buds as sachets to actually make enough money. So the budgeting tools that I mentioned, this article that's linked in the previous slide, and then in here, the links in this slide, take you to planting budgets and production budgets for northern and more southern planting zones. So this will give you a bit of an idea of how to plan for and budget for growing lavender if you're going to market it for different uses, whether that's dry bouquets or sachets or culinary. I wanted to mention a bit more about culinary lavenders because culinary lavender is something that is very popular right now. It's popular in a bunch of beverages that you buy at grocery stores. The lavender blackberry, all the stuff that you see in seltzers and drinks. And then I also wanted to mention that lavender coffees, teas. I don't know who's been to Starbucks recently, but they've got a lavender everything, lavender matcha, lavender ube. All of these things can be created using dry culinary lavender buds and altering those buds to meet whatever your culinary goal is. These are all examples of culinary lavender that I've seen recently. There is a book that has been popular for years, a recipe book by Nancy Baggett that goes through different ways you can use lavender in cooking. Everything savory to sweet is covered. And that is the end of the formal presentation, except I want to jump out and see if I can show you just briefly one of those budgeting tools. And I'm not seeing it. So let me stop sharing and we can start answering questions. And then maybe I can find the budgeting tool.